Marry Barrett Voss's nephew, or I call the IRS in the morning. That evening, Lenora called Margot into the back room. No one else was present. No neighbors, no lawyer, no witnesses. Just two women and a yellow envelope sitting on the table. Lenora did not look at Margot when she spoke. She pulled a stack of papers from the envelope, set them down, and turned them toward Margot. A deed transfer the house that Margot had believed was the place she was allowed to exist for the past 8 years had belonged to Barrett Voss for 3 months. This house isn't ours anymore, Lenora said, her voice as flat as if she were reading a utility bill. Barrett agreed to let us stay. But there's a condition. Margot stood still. Not because she was shocked. She had lived long enough in this house to know that Lenora never called her into the back room just to talk. His nephew just got out of prison, and he needs a wife. Sterling Voss, the name the entire West Side had been whispering about for a month. They said he had beaten a man half to death at a charity gala in Gold Coast, in front of 200 guests. They said even his own family refused to claim him. That man. Margot looked down at the papers, then back at Lenora. What if I say no? Lenora tilted her head, the same tilt Margot had seen hundreds of times over 8 years. The tilt of someone who knows she is holding the blade by the right end. You've been doing freelance accounting for 2 shops in South Loop. No tax filings. 8 years. She paused. Do you want me to keep going? Margot said nothing. Lenora stood up, pushed her chair in, and walked out of the room. The envelope remained on the table, open, like a trap that had already closed while the prey still didn't know she was standing inside it. But here is what Lenora did not know. What she could not have known, because no one had told her. The man she had just forced her stepdaughter to marry was not the monster the entire city was talking about, and the girl she expected to bow her head and obey had never once bowed. She simply hadn't found her reason to look up. Stay with this story. Because it does not end the way anyone in that room expected it to. If you want to know what she did when the whole world expected her to bow, hit that like button to support us. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Lenora closed the bedroom door. The sound of her footsteps faded down the hallway, then disappeared completely. Margot stood alone in front of the desk, the envelope still lying there, the stack of papers still open. She didn't touch it. She had read enough. Barrett Voss's signature sat in the lower right corner, blue ink, the firm stroke of a man used to signing important things without needing long to think. 3 months ago. This house had changed owners 3 months ago, and she hadn't known a thing. Lenora had lived under another person's roof for 90 days, eaten at another person's table, slept in another person's bed, and still ordered Margot around every morning as though everything still belonged to her. Margot looked at the envelope one last time, then turned and walked out. She went down the hallway toward the back of the house, past the living room where Paige was lying on the sofa looking at her phone, past the kitchen where the sink was still full of dishes she hadn't had time to clear after dinner. Paige didn't look up, didn't ask. Her stepsister had never asked Margot anything, unless she needed the wireless internet password or cash. The storage room at the back of the house. The room was smaller than Paige's bathroom, with no window, only a small ventilation opening close to the ceiling. Margot stepped inside, locked the door, and sat down on the edge of the bed, the thin mattress. The sheet she had bought herself, the only pillow, already flattened, which she hadn't replaced because she didn't want to spend money on something Lenora could take away at any moment. 8 years sleeping in this room, 8 years turning it into the only place in the house where no one entered. She pulled the old laptop out from under the bed. The laptop Lenora didn't know she had. Bought with freelance money. An older model with the screen slightly yellowed in the left corner. But it still worked. She opened it, waited for it to start up, then began searching. Sterling Voss. She typed that name and read everything that appeared. The article in the Tribune about the incident at the Gold Coast fundraiser 2 years earlier. A short local news piece about the trial. A business magazine analysis of the Voss Corporation and the leadership change after the direct heir was convicted. She read it all, without rushing. The way she read was the way she read ledgers, line by line, number by number, looking for the place that didn't add up. Then she saw the photograph, a picture of Sterling being led out of the courthouse. 2 police officers on either side, reporters in front. But his face was what made her stop. Not angry, not afraid, not lowered. His eyes looked straight into the camera, not with defiance, but with the expression of someone who knew exactly where he was and accepted it for a reason no one else could see. Margot enlarged the photograph, looked at it longer. She had read enough ledgers in her life to know when numbers were lying, and she had looked at enough faces in this house to know when a person was hiding something. The face in that photograph wasn't the face of a man who had just lost. It was the face of a man waiting. Waiting for what? She didn't know. But she knew the difference between someone forced into a corner and someone who had walked into that corner on purpose because he knew there was a way out on the other side. She closed the laptop, slid it back under the bed, turned off the light, lay down in the dark, eyes open, staring at the ceiling where a crack ran from the corner of the room to the ventilation opening. The whole neighborhood said Sterling Voss was a monster. Lenora said she had no choice. Paige would laugh in her face if she knew. And Friday was only 3 days away. But Margot didn't think about those things. For the first time in 8 years of living in this storage room, she didn't lie down with the thought, "Tomorrow I have to endure it again." She lay down with a different thought. She would watch. She would meet the man in that photograph, and she would read him for herself, the same way she read every set of books Lenora thought she didn't understand, with her eyes, with patience, with the habit of someone who had grown used to finding the truth among numbers other people had deliberately arranged wrong. Lenora thought she would be afraid. The whole neighborhood thought she should be afraid. But Margot had lived 8 years with Lenora Whitfield, and if those 8 years had taught her one single thing, it was this. The people the world told her she should fear were often not nearly as dangerous as the people the world told her she should trust. To understand why Margot lay in that dark storage room that night without fear, one had to go back 8 years, to when everything began. Her father died on a November afternoon. Suddenly, with no time for final words, no time to leave behind a will. Margot was 19, freshly graduated from community college with an accounting degree, and she hadn't even had time to apply for her first job. Lenora, by then, had been her father's second wife for 4 years. The woman hadn't given birth to her, hadn't raised her, but she stood in the front row at the funeral as though she were the one who had lost the most. 3 days after the funeral, Lenora called Margot into the living room, sat down, poured tea, then said in a very gentle voice that Margot could stay. "You don't have anyone but this house," she said. "I'll take care of you, but you have to help me." Help. That was the word Lenora used. Not work, not repay a debt. Help. And Margot, 19 years old, having just buried her father, with not a single relative left in the world, believed her from that moment on. The help Lenora needed wasn't cooking or cleaning. Lenora had 2 small real estate offices on the south side, the kind of offices that rented out signs, brokered cheap houses, and occasionally handled a few transactions that Margot would later understand weren't entirely legitimate. Lenora needed someone to keep the books, someone who knew how to add and subtract, knew how to file reports, knew how to arrange invoices so that they looked clean from the outside, while no one could really inspect what was inside. Margot had an accounting degree. Margot was free labor. Margot had nowhere else to go. 3 perfect conditions. From then on, Margot managed the finances for both offices. No salary, no contract. Not $1 from the money she handled every month ever flowed into her hands. Lenora called it a contribution to the family. At the same time, Margot got an accounting job at a small company in the South Loop, the kind of office where the air conditioner only worked on half the room and everyone pretended not to notice. The pay wasn't high, but it was steady. Every month, that entire paycheck went to Lenora. Lenora called it the cost of raising her. 8 years, every month, the same white envelope placed on the kitchen table on the 5th. Margot never missed a single month. Paige was different. Lenora's biological daughter slept until noon, didn't work, didn't know how much the monthly electric bill cost, didn't know where grocery money came from. Paige bought new shoes every 2 weeks, changed phones every year, ate out with her friends, and sent the bills home. Lenora never asked Paige a single question about money, and Paige never asked why Margot slept in the storage room. But Margot wasn't entirely empty-handed the way Lenora thought. At night, after the whole house had gone to sleep, she opened her laptop and did freelance accounting for 2 small shops in the neighborhood. No one knew. The money wasn't much, but it came regularly, and Margot used it for one thing only: tuition. Term by term, course by course, she completed an online master's program in finance at a university in the East. Classes at 11 o'clock at night, exams at 2 o'clock in the morning, a thesis written in the storage room under a desk lamp she had to cover, so the light wouldn't slip out through the crack beneath the door. The day she received her degree, no one congratulated her. because no one knew. She downloaded the diploma file, saved it to a USB drive, then closed the laptop the way she did every night. That USB drive. The very same USB drive Margot hid inside a tampon box at the back of a drawer, where no one in this house would ever think to look. Inside it wasn't only her degree. There were 8 years of data, photographs of invoices from Lenora's 2 offices, quarterly income and expense reconciliation sheets Margot had created herself. Items Lenora had told her were operating expenses, but that didn't match any invoice at all. Numbers Lenora said one way out loud, while the paperwork said something else entirely. Margot didn't keep those things for revenge. She didn't have any plan. She kept them because that was the habit of the profession. A good accountant never let a number disappear without a copy, even if no one asked, even if no one checked, even if no one cared. She recorded them because the truth needed to be recorded. That was all. And that was Margot Whitfield at 27, a young woman with a master's degree no one knew about, with 8 years of data no one suspected, sleeping in a storage room no one questioned, and about to step into a marriage no one had given her the right to refuse. But if Lenora had known what was on that USB drive, perhaps she wouldn't have been so confident when she placed the envelope on the table the night before. Perhaps she would have thought twice before calling that girl into her private room and telling her she had no choice. Because the truth was, Margot had always had a choice. She had simply never needed to use it. 3 months before the night, Lenora placed the envelope on the table. Before Margot knew the name Sterling Voss, before the whole West Side began whispering, there was a meeting no one in that house was allowed to know about. Barrett Voss came on a Tuesday afternoon. He didn't call ahead, didn't make an appointment. He drove over, parked right in front of the door, stepped out, and knocked, as though this house had already belonged to him for a long time. And in truth, it did. Lenora simply hadn't been willing to admit it yet. Barrett Voss, 58 years old, chairman of the Voss Corporation on paper. Real estate, construction, transportation, restaurants. Those were the things on the surface. Beneath that, the Voss Corporation operated a network where not every transaction came with an invoice, not every sum of money passed through a bank, and not every partner appeared under a real name. From Chicago to Detroit, from warehouses in the suburbs to brightly lit office towers in the Loop, Barrett's money flowed through dozens of companies, most of which existed only on paper. He wasn't the kind of man who shouted in a meeting room. He was the kind of man who spoke softly, and everyone in the room fell silent to listen. Lenora owed Barrett. The debt had begun 2 years earlier. When she got involved in a real estate deal, she didn't have enough money to complete. She needed capital. Barrett lent it to her. The interest rate wasn't written on paper, only spoken aloud, and both of them understood that this kind of money wasn't repaid with monthly checks. When the deal failed, Lenora lost money, but the debt to Barrett didn't disappear. It only grew larger. And Barrett was the kind of man who never forgot who owed him. That afternoon, Lenora poured coffee for Barrett in the living room. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the cup down. Barrett didn't drink. He sat still, looking around the room as though he were appraising every object in it. Then he spoke. "I didn't come to collect money," Barrett said. "I came because I have an offer." His nephew, Sterling, was about to be released from prison within a few weeks, and Sterling needed a wife. Not the kind of wife his family could find among Chicago's upper circles, because no family in that class wanted to marry off a daughter to a man who had just served his time. Barrett needed a different girl, a girl with no family, no connections, no power, no knowledge of how Barrett's world operated. A girl Barrett could place beside Sterling as a pair of eyes, a pair of ears, someone who would report back to him everything Sterling did after he got out, because Barrett didn't trust his nephew. He had spent 2 years rebuilding the empire in his own way while Sterling sat behind bars, and he had no intention of letting Sterling come back and break apart what he had arranged. "Your stepdaughter," Barrett said, "the one who sleeps in the room at the back. She's an accountant, isn't she?" Lenora nodded. "Does she have anyone? Family? A boyfriend? Relatives?" "No one," Lenora said. "She only has this house." Barrett nodded, slowly, like a man who had just found the right piece he needed on the board. "Clear the entire debt," he said. "You keep the house. In return, your stepdaughter marries Sterling, the Friday after he gets out." Lenora didn't ask why. Didn't ask what kind of man Sterling was. Didn't ask what Margot's life would be like. She looked down at the coffee Barrett hadn't drunk, then looked up. "What if the girl refuses?" Barrett leaned forward. You've lived with her for 8 years. You know better than I do what she's afraid of. He stood. I'll send the house transfer papers through the lawyer this week. From now on, this house belongs to me on paper. You want to stay here. You know the condition. Barrett walked to the door. He didn't shake hands. Didn't say goodbye. He left like a man who had just finished a small transaction for the day. The kind of transaction he could carry out before lunch and forget before dinner. To Barrett, Margot wasn't a person. She was a line in a spreadsheet, an offset, an item exchanged at equal value whose name he didn't need to know. He looked at her file and saw, 27 years old, accountant, no family, no connections, no money, no power. Perfect. Exactly the kind of person he could place wherever he wanted, without fearing she would fight back. But this was what Barrett Voss, with all his networks and power and undeclared streams of money, had miscalculated. He looked at Margot on paper and saw 0. No family, no connections, no strength. He didn't know about the USB drive, didn't know about the master's degree, didn't know that the girl he had just bought with a cleared debt had spent 8 years reading every number that passed through Lenora's hands and recording all of it. With his own hands, he had just given Sterling Voss something no money could buy, no lawyer could create, and no rival in Chicago's underground business world could ever match. He gave Sterling a person who knew how to read the truth among lying numbers, and who never forgot what she had read. Margot didn't know about the meeting between Barrett and Lenora 3 months earlier. She didn't know she was a line in someone else's spreadsheet, an offset already calculated before she had even had the chance to open her mouth. The only thing she knew was that on Wednesday morning, 2 days before the wedding, Lenora walked into the storage room at 7 o'clock, threw a brand new shirt with the tag still on it onto her bed, and said, "Wear this. Someone wants to meet you at noon. Don't talk too much." The restaurant was in the West Loop, the kind of restaurant that, from the outside, showed only dark glass and a small sign, with no menu posted by the door, because the people who came here didn't need to ask the price. Barrett was already seated when Margot and Lenora arrived. He sat at the far corner table, his back to the wall, his face turned toward the door, the posture of a man used to watching who came in before that person ever saw him. Barrett stood when the 2 women approached, pulled out a chair for Lenora, nodded at Margot, but didn't pull out a chair for her. Margot pulled out her own chair, sat down, and placed her hands in her lap. She looked around the table. 3 people, 1 empty chair, 20 minutes. They sat there waiting for 20 minutes. Barrett ordered water. Lenora drank. Margot ordered nothing. Barrett spoke with Lenora about a piece of land on the south side of the city, his voice ordinary, as though today's meeting were nothing more than a normal lunch between 2 acquaintances. No one mentioned Sterling. No one mentioned the wedding. No one looked at Margot. Then the door opened. Sterling Voss walked in. Not quickly. Not slowly. With the stride of a man who didn't need to hurry because there was no one in this room who could make him hurry. He wore a black shirt, the collar unbuttoned, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. No tie. No watch. He walked straight to the table, pulled out the chair, and sat down. He didn't apologize for being late, didn't greet Lenora, didn't shake Barrett's hand. He raised a hand to signal the server and said 2 words. Black coffee. Then he placed both hands on the table and looked straight ahead, not at anyone in particular. Barrett waited until the coffee had been brought out. Then he began. He turned to Margot and introduced her to Sterling in a voice Margot recognized at once, a salesman's voice. This is Margot, Lenora's stepdaughter. Very obedient, knows how to keep a home, knows how to take care of family matters, studied accounting, works hard. Barrett spoke about her as if he were reading product specifications from a catalog, enough for the buyer to picture the item, but not enough for the buyer to ask questions. Lenora nodded beside him, adding support with the smile Margot had seen her use every time she needed someone to believe what she was saying. Sterling didn't react. He drank his coffee. As soon as the cup was set down, he picked it up, took a sip, and put it back. His eyes were fixed on the empty space above Barrett's head, as though the man wasn't worth lowering his gaze for. Barrett kept talking, adding a few more sentences about Margot, about Lenora, about how suitable this arrangement was. Sterling kept drinking his coffee. Silent. No nod, no shake of the head. Not a single expression on his face changed. That silence was heavier than anything anyone could have said. It forced Barrett to stop speaking, forced Lenora to stop smiling, forced the whole table to wait. Then Sterling set the cup down. He turned and looked at Margot. For the first time during the entire meeting, he looked at one person in particular, not a glance, a direct look, the kind of look that wasn't searching the surface, but reading something behind it. Margot looked back. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't turn away. Sterling asked, his voice low, not loud, only enough for the person across from him to hear. "Do you want to be here?" All 4 people at the table knew he wasn't asking about the restaurant. Barrett's back stiffened in his chair. Lenora placed her hand on the edge of the table, as if searching for something to hold on to. Margot looked at Sterling, looked straight into the eyes of the man the whole city said she should fear, and answered in an ordinary voice, not trembling, not trying to sound strong, only telling the truth. "I've never been asked that before." 1 second. Sterling looked at her for 1 more second. Then he moved the coffee cup aside, turned to Barrett, and said shortly, "Friday." Then he stood, pushed in the chair, walked out of the restaurant without looking back, without shaking anyone's hand, without saying another word. Barrett sat still for a while after Sterling left. Lenora did too. Margot was the first to move. She picked up the glass of water she hadn't touched since she had sat down, took 1 sip, and set it back. Her hand was steady, but inside her mind, something had shifted. For the whole 20 minutes Sterling sat at that table. He hadn't looked at Barrett once with the eyes of someone below looking up at someone above. No fear, no submission, not even rebellion. He looked at Barrett with the eyes of someone who was waiting. Waiting for what? Margot didn't know yet, but she had spent 8 years reading books for Lenora, and she knew the difference between someone holding a knife and someone keeping the knife in a drawer, waiting for the right moment to pull it out. Sterling Voss wasn't the monster the neighborhood described. He wasn't a victim either. He was something Margot couldn't yet name, but there was one thing she knew for certain. The man who had just walked out of that restaurant wasn't a man who was losing. And Barrett Voss, still sitting at the table with the cup of coffee his nephew had drunk from and left behind, perhaps knew it too. He just wasn't ready to admit it. Friday arrived faster than Margot had expected, or perhaps it didn't arrive quickly at all. But the 2 days between the meeting at the restaurant and this morning had passed through a strange kind of silence she had never known before. Lenora said nothing more about the wedding. She didn't ask whether Margot agreed, because in Lenora's mind, that question had never existed. Paige was the same as always, lying on the sofa scrolling through her phone, not knowing and not needing to know what was happening to the stepsister who slept in the storage room at the back of the house. On Friday morning, Margot woke at 5 o'clock, washed her face, then heard the phone ringing in Lenora's room. 5 minutes later, Lenora opened her bedroom door and called down the hallway in an ordinary voice, as if she were announcing the weather. "I'm busy today. Go by yourself." Then she closed the door again. "Go by yourself. To her own wedding." Margot stood in the hallway listening to the door shut and didn't feel surprised. After 8 years of living in this house, she had learned that Lenora never appeared anywhere unless there was something in it for her. This wedding was a transaction between Barrett and Lenora, and that transaction had been complete from the moment the house transfer papers were signed. Lenora didn't need to come. She had already received her share. Margot knocked on Paige's door. No one answered. She knocked again. Paige's voice drifted out, sleepy and irritated. "What?" Margot said. "I'm leaving today." Paige was silent for 1 second, then said, "Leaving where?" Margot didn't answer. She went back to her room. The white dress hung behind the storage room door. Margot had bought it 2 days earlier, after the meeting at the restaurant, at a thrift store in Pilsen. Freelance money, a small amount she managed to hide each month. The dress was simple, cotton, no lace, no decoration, falling past her knees. The kind of dress the seller didn't ask about because it could be for work, for going out, or for anything at all. Margot put it on, looked at herself in the small mirror hanging on the wall, smoothed her hair, then walked out. No one took a photograph. No one told her she looked beautiful. No one stood at the door watching her leave. Chicago City Hall, 2nd floor, marriage registration office. Margot arrived by bus. She stood in the hallway at 9:15, 15 minutes earlier than the appointed time. The hallway was quiet, with only a few couples sitting on the chairs along the wall. There was a young couple, the girl holding a small bouquet, the boy holding her hand, both of them smiling. There was an older couple sitting side by side, reading their papers, with a mother beside them holding a sleeping grandchild. Margot stood alone at the end of the hallway. No flowers, no family, no one holding her hand. Sterling arrived exactly on time. He stepped into the hallway with two people. An older man with silver hair, his back slightly bent but his steps still steady, carrying an old leather briefcase under one arm. Mr. Hargrove, and a woman around 65, her salt and pepper hair neatly twisted into a bun at the back of her neck, wearing a dark coat and flat shoes. Mrs. Bellamy, the only two people who came with Sterling to the wedding. Not family, not friends, but the way they walked beside Sterling, not too close, not too far, showed that they had been with him for a very long time. Sterling looked at Margot at the end of the hallway. He didn't stop walking, didn't say anything. He simply came straight toward her, stopped a few steps away, then gave a slight nod. Not a social nod, the kind of nod from someone confirming that she was here, that he saw her, and that was enough. The registration room was smaller than Margot had imagined. A wooden table, 2 chairs, the judge seated behind it. Hargrove and Mrs. Bellamy stood at the back of the room. No music, no decorations. The judge was a middle-aged woman with the tired eyes of someone who had read the same passage hundreds of times each year. She read the vows. Sterling answered. Margot answered. Both of their voices were ordinary, not trembling, not rushed, as though they were signing a contract whose terms they both understood, but whose outcome they did not yet know. Then the judge stopped at the sentence every wedding had. Does anyone object to this marriage? Silence. Sterling turned around. He didn't turn toward Hargrove or Mrs. Bellamy. He turned to look behind Margot, the place where someone should have been. A mother, a father, siblings, friends, someone, anyone. Standing there and watching her step into the most important day of her life. That space was empty. No one was there, only a row of plastic chairs and a white wall. Sterling looked at that emptiness for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned back, looked at the judge, and nodded. He said nothing about what he had just seen, made no comment, showed no pity. But Margot knew he had looked, and she knew he had understood, because that look wasn't curiosity. It was the look of someone recognizing something familiar, as if the empty space behind Margot's back wasn't entirely foreign to him. The judge signed the papers. Hargrove signed as a witness. Mrs. Bellamy signed beside him. Done. The entire ceremony, from beginning to end, lasted no more than 15 minutes. When they stepped back into the hallway, Sterling walked ahead, opened the door, and held it for Margot to pass through. Not because he was being polite, because it was a habit, the action of a man who did everything in order and didn't need anyone to remind him. The car was parked outside the lobby. The old black SUV Margot had seen in the photograph she found online that night. Sterling opened the passenger door, waited for her to get in, then closed it. Hargrove and Mrs. Bellamy took the car behind them. The car pulled away from downtown, not turning north toward the high-rises along Lakeshore Drive, not heading west toward the mansions in Oak Park. The car drove south, toward Bridgeport, toward a place Margot had never been, had never heard of, and had no picture in her mind of what was waiting for her behind the door. The car turned onto a small street in Bridgeport and stopped in front of a 2-story house set among old oak trees. Margot looked through the car window and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. She had imagined many things on the way here from City Hall. A mansion with an iron gate. A penthouse on the top floor of some building in the Loop. A place worthy of the name all of Chicago whispered when it was mentioned. But in front of her stood an old house, its red brick walls darkened with age, its tiled roof patched in places with sheet metal, its low white wooden fence peeling on several slats. The front yard was small, with a maple tree whose leaves had begun to turn yellow and a concrete step leading up to the front door. A working-class neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, a place where people left for the early shift before the sky was light and came home after the streetlights had already come on. Sterling Voss lived here. Mrs. Bellamy was the one who opened the door. She had arrived first in the car behind them, and when Margot stepped onto the front step, the woman stood in the doorway, not hugging her, not smiling, not greeting her with any line Margot had ever heard in movies about new brides. She only said, "The room is upstairs. I put fresh towels on the bed." Then she turned back into the kitchen. The sound of water running in the sink, the sound of the gas stove lighting. Mrs. Bellamy didn't ask whether Margot was tired, whether she was hungry, whether she wanted to talk. She had prepared what Margot needed before Margot arrived, and that was enough. Margot watched her for a few seconds, then stepped inside. The inside of the house was clean and simple, the kind of clean that came from people living there a long time and taking care of it, not the kind of clean that came from hired cleaners. A narrow hallway, a bookshelf running along one wall from the entrance to the back of the house, packed with books but arranged neatly. The kitchen was in the back, the living room on the right, and a wooden staircase on the left led to the second floor. Nothing expensive, nothing unnecessary. Sterling stood at the foot of the stairs. He pointed upward. "Your room is upstairs, at the end of the hall on the left. Mine is at the end of the hall on the right. 2 separate rooms, 2 different directions." He didn't explain why, and Margot didn't ask. She carried the small bag she had brought from Lenora's house, with only a few sets of clothes, her laptop, and the USB drive lying at the bottom of the bag, wrapped in 3 layers of cloth. Then she went up the stairs. The room was smaller than a normal bedroom, but 3 times larger than the storage room at Lenora's house. A single bed, white sheets, new pillows, a window overlooking the backyard, where there was a wild apple tree and a clothesline tied between 2 wooden posts. On the bed were fresh towels, folded square, placed beside a bar of soap still in its wrapper. Mrs. Bellamy. Margot set down her bag, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked around. For the first time in 8 years, she was sitting in a room where no one could knock on the door at midnight and tell her to get up and do more work. During the first days in Bridgeport, Sterling was almost invisible. He left the house early, before Margot even woke up, and came home late, after the living room lights had already been turned off. He didn't ask whether she had eaten, didn't ask whether she had slept well, didn't ask whether she needed anything, not because he didn't care, but because he gave her space, the kind of space that only someone who had once been locked somewhere too tight knew how to leave for another person. Mrs. Bellamy was the only one who gave the house its rhythm. She cooked 2 meals a day, left Margot's portion on the stove if Margot ate late, and after washing the dishes, she sat at the kitchen table reading until evening. She didn't ask Margot much. From time to time she would say, "The laundry is done. I hung it in the backyard," or, "I'm making soup tonight. Can you eat that?" No philosophy, no advice, just short, practical sentences from someone used to caring with her hands instead of her words. On the first weekend, Margot heard the sound of a hammer downstairs at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning. She went down the stairs and saw Sterling fixing the bathroom door hinge. He was kneeling on the floor, the toolbox open beside him, a screwdriver in his hand, his eyes fixed on the hinge as though nothing in the world mattered more than making sure this door opened and closed properly. He didn't look up when Margot walked past. She didn't stop either. On Sunday, she woke at 7 o'clock and smelled hot butter coming from the kitchen. She went downstairs and saw Sterling standing in front of the gas stove, frying eggs, a cast-iron skillet, a low flame, 2 plates already set on the table. He didn't turn around when he heard her footsteps. He only said, "Sit down." Margot sat. He placed a plate of eggs in front of her, then sat across from her with his own plate. He said nothing more. They ate in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't heavy, only the silence of 2 people who didn't yet know what to say to each other and therefore didn't try to force it. Margot washed the dishes after breakfast. Sterling went into the backyard and continued fixing something on the fence. She stood in front of the sink, looking out the window, watching the man whose name the whole city spoke in whispers measure a fence slat with a tape measure, cut it with a handsaw, and nail it back into place. Patient. Meticulous. Like someone used to doing everything with his own hands and trusting no one to do it for him. And Margot began to wonder, which story was true? The man who had injured someone in front of 200 guests in the Gold Coast, or the man who fried eggs at 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning in a small kitchen in Bridgeport and repaired the fence alone in the backyard? She didn't have an answer yet, but she knew one thing. She would keep watching, because that was the one thing she did better than anyone in this house, and better than anyone in the city outside whispering his name. But now, one thing has to be understood, because without understanding this, the rest of the story won't make sense. We have to go back 2 years, to 3 hours before Sterling Voss was led out of the courthouse, with 2 police officers on either side and reporters' lenses pointed at his face. 3 hours before that moment, Sterling was sitting in a law office in the Loop, on the 12th floor, in a room overlooking the Chicago River. Across from him was Hargrove, 66 years old at the time, his hair almost entirely gray, his back already beginning to bend, but his eyes still sharp with the look of a man who had read contracts for 35 years and had never missed a single comma. Hargrove had served the Voss family since Sterling's father was still alive. He knew where the money flowed, knew which door opened into which room, knew which names could be trusted and which names should be avoided. And he knew that this morning would be the last time he sat across from Sterling for a very long while. Sterling placed two things on the table: a portable hard drive, small, black, cased, old but still working, and a folded sheet of paper, handwritten, 14 names arranged from top to bottom. No numbers, no notes, only names. Sterling pushed both across the table toward Hargrove. 14 people, Sterling said. You follow all of them. Record every transaction they make with Barrett over the next 2 years. Every payment, every call, every contract. Don't miss anything. Hargrove picked up the paper and read each name. His eyes stopped on several of them, his brows tightening slightly, but he didn't ask. He set the paper down and looked at Sterling. You're accepting the loss of your freedom while these 14 people are still walking around outside? Sterling didn't answer right away. He looked out the window at the river below, then turned back. I only have part of the evidence. This hard drive is what I've gathered over the past 2 years. Enough for me to know what Barrett is doing, but not enough to charge him federally. If I use it now, Barrett will know what I have, and he'll destroy everything within 48 hours. I've seen him do it before. He isn't a man who leaves traces behind once he knows someone is watching. Hargrove nodded slowly. So you let him think you've lost? I let him think I'm no longer a concern. 2 years. I'll be inside, and he'll be outside. He'll get comfortable. He'll expand. He'll sign more, spend more, pull more people in, and he'll leave traces, because people always leave traces when they think no one is watching. Sterling paused. 2 years. Is that enough for you? Hargrove looked at the hard drive on the table, then at the list, then at Sterling. I'll have enough, because this was the truth that no one out there knew. That night in Gold Coast, at the charity fundraiser the press wrote about for weeks afterward, Sterling Voss didn't attack anyone. He had been set up. Barrett staged everything from beginning to end. The man who caused the trouble was Barrett's man, hired to provoke Sterling in front of the crowd. The witnesses were false witnesses, already told what to say to the police. And the police had been called before the incident even happened, because Barrett knew exactly which minute everything would begin. He had written the script. He had chosen the day. He had chosen the place. Somewhere elegant enough for the press to care, crowded enough to have witnesses, and public enough that Sterling couldn't deny he had been there. Barrett needed Sterling to disappear, not because he hated his nephew, but because Sterling was the only rightful heir to the Voss empire, and as long as Sterling was free, Barrett was only the temporary man holding the chairman's seat. Sterling's father died when Sterling was 22 years old. Barrett took over the corporation, under the title of temporary guardian. Temporary lasted 11 years. During those 11 years, Barrett turned the Voss Corporation from a construction and real estate business into a network where not every dollar was clean. Sterling knew. Sterling began gathering evidence, and Barrett knew Sterling knew. The Gold Coast incident was Barrett's way of solving the problem, quickly, neatly, publicly, and legally on the surface. Sterling knew he had been framed. He knew it from the moment that man walked up to his table with eyes too intentional to be accidental. He knew it when he saw Barrett sitting at the far corner table, not interfering, only watching, calm as ever. He knew it when the police arrived within 4 minutes, faster than any emergency call in Gold Coast on a Saturday night. He knew everything, and he still let it happen. Because Sterling Voss wasn't the kind of man who reacted before he was ready. He was the kind of man who looked at a trap, stepped into it, and turned the trap into part of his own plan. 2 years without freedom wasn't the price he was forced to pay. It was the price he chose to pay, because he knew that once Barrett thought his nephew had lost, Barrett Voss would begin making mistakes. And Hargrove would be out there, recording every single one of them. Sterling stood. He buttoned his shirt, pulled down his sleeves, and looked at Hargrove one last time. You're the only person I trust. Hargrove didn't answer with words. He stood, stepped around the table, and placed a hand on Sterling's shoulder for 1 second. Only 1 second. Then he let go. Sterling nodded, turned, and walked to the door. 3 hours later, he stood in front of the courthouse, 2 police officers on either side, reporters' lenses aimed at his face, eyes straight ahead, not angry, not afraid. The face of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The same face Margot had seen in the photograph on her laptop screen that night, inside the storage room at Lenora's house. She had been right. He wasn't a man who was losing. He was a man who was waiting. And 2 years had passed. He had waited long enough. 2 weeks after the wedding, Margot did something no one in the Bridgeport house expected. She didn't tell Sterling, didn't tell Mrs. Bellamy, didn't ask anyone's opinion. She went online, found the Voss Corporation's hiring page, read through the list of open positions, and applied for a job in the accounting department at the headquarters in the Loop. The resume she sent through Human Resources was ordinary, like any applicant from outside. Name, Margot Whitfield, not Margot Voss. Master's degree in finance. Real accounting experience at a company in the South Loop. Full professional certifications. Not a single line mentioned Sterling. Not a single line mentioned Bridgeport. Human Resources called back after 3 days. The interview came after 5 days. The offer came after 1 week, faster than usual. But Margot knew the reason wasn't because she was Sterling's wife. The Voss Corporation was expanding its new construction division. The accounting department needed more people, and her resume was stronger than most of the applicants they had received. A master's degree in finance applying for an entry-level accountant position, instead of the other way around. Human Resources didn't ask too many questions, because to them, it was an easy hire. But before Human Resources made its decision, Margot's file had passed across Barrett's desk. Not because of procedure, because Barrett controlled everything that entered and left the corporation, including people. When he saw the name Margot Whitfield on the applicant list, he wasn't surprised. He didn't stop it either. He looked at the file and saw entry-level accountant, no access to high-level data, seated on the 3rd floor in an open office with 12 other employees. And he already had Dennis there. Dennis was the first person to act friendly toward Margot when she walked into the accounting department on her first day. He greeted her, showed her where to sit, asked whether she wanted coffee or tea, his voice warm and easy in the way every company seemed to have one kind-hearted coworker. Barrett hired Margot because he wanted her right in front of his eyes, somewhere he could watch her, instead of leaving her at the Bridgeport house, where he couldn't reach. Margot started work on her first Monday. The job wasn't much different from what she had done in the South Loop. Data entry, reconciliation, invoice review, monthly expense reports. The accounting software was newer, the system more complex, but the principle was the same. Numbers didn't know how to lie if the person reading them knew how to ask. And Margot knew how to ask. In the first week, she noticed 3 expenses that didn't match. Not obvious mistakes, not typing errors or mistaken codes. More subtle than that. 3 wire transfers to 3 different companies, each for a moderate amount. Not large enough to trigger an automatic alert, but not small enough to be meaningless either. She looked up the registered addresses of all 3 companies. 2 of them shared the same address in suburban Detroit, a building that showed up on the map as nothing but an empty lot. The 3rd company was registered at an address in Chicago, but it had no phone number, no website, and no employees appearing in any public tax record, no matching invoice, no approval signature from internal audit. Money went out, but nothing came back. Shell companies. Margot recognized it in the first week, because she had seen this kind of transaction before. At Lenora's 2 real estate offices. Smaller, cruder, but built on the same principle. Create a name on paper, move money into it, let the money disappear, and no one asks. She didn't ask Dennis, didn't ask the manager, didn't ask anyone in the department. She recorded it. Transaction code, transfer date, amount, receiving company name, registered address, approver name if there was one, and none if there wasn't. She saved it in a separate file. Password protected, hidden in a folder no one but she knew about. Old habit. 8 years in Lenora's house had taught her. When a number looked wrong, record it. Stay silent and wait. Don't react. Don't report. Don't panic. Just record. Because numbers didn't run away if someone patient enough held them in place. Sterling knew Margot had applied before she sent the resume. His person in Human Resources reported it the same day she applied. He didn't stop her. Didn't call Human Resources and tell them to reject her. Didn't call and tell them to prioritize her either. He did nothing. He waited. He waited to see what she would do once she walked into that building. Once she sat at a desk 3 floors below Barrett's office. Once she saw the numbers an ordinary person would overlook because no one had told them to look. He waited to see how Margot Whitfield, the girl Barrett had bought with a cleared debt and Lenora had sold with a nod, would respond when the truth was lying right in front of her on a computer screen. She didn't run to Barrett to accuse Sterling. She didn't panic and quit. She didn't tell anyone. She recorded it and waited. When Sterling received this information, not from Margot but from his own person, he was sitting at the kitchen table in the Bridgeport house, reading the newspaper at 9 o'clock at night. He set the paper down and stared into the empty space in front of him for a long while. Then he folded the newspaper, placed it neatly on the table, and went upstairs. He didn't knock on Margot's door, didn't say anything to her that night, but he had understood something Barrett didn't understand, something Lenora didn't understand, something perhaps even Margot herself didn't yet understand about who she was. She wasn't a pawn. She wasn't a victim. She was like him, someone who knew how to wait. Dennis asked too many questions. That was the first thing Margot noticed when she stepped into her second week at the Voss Corporation. Not the kind of questions asked by a curious person, because curious people asked about everything, about life, about family, about what someone did over the weekend. Dennis didn't ask those things. Dennis asked about work. More specifically, Dennis asked about files. Which account are you reconciling? Have you finished this month's summary sheet? Did you already send yesterday's file to the manager? I didn't get a chance to look at it. Every question sounded natural. Every question could have come from a kind coworker who only wanted to help. But they came too regularly. Every day. In the same pattern. And they always circled around one thing, what Margot was looking at inside the system. In the third week, Margot tested him. She created a separate Excel file, detached from the main system, and named it like an ordinary reconciliation sheet. Inside it, she entered a fake expense. $1,200,000 transferred to a company called Greenfield Partners. The company didn't exist. The address was one she invented. The account number was one she made up at random. The figure was large enough that anyone who saw it would remember it, but not so large that it would look suspicious inside a corporation the size of Voss. She saved the file, then left it somewhere Dennis could see it. She didn't send it directly. She only opened it on her screen when Dennis walked past, then minimized it, just enough for him to read the title and the first few lines. Exactly the kind of careless mistake a new employee might make. Dennis walked by. Margot minimized the file. She didn't turn back to look. 2 days later, the internal finance department meeting, the kind of monthly meeting Barrett occasionally attended to stay informed. Margot sat at the back of the room, saying nothing, only taking notes. Barrett stood in front of the projector screen, talking about third-quarter cash flow, new investments, expansion plans. Then he stopped at one slide, looked down at the notes in his hand, and said, "I see a transfer to Greenfield Partners, $1.2 million. Whoever is responsible for this, check it again for me." Barrett said it normally, in an ordinary voice, as though he were reading from an official report, but Margot knew Greenfield Partners didn't exist. That number wasn't in any official report. It existed in only one file, the file only one person besides her had seen. Margot didn't react. She wrote Greenfield Partners in her notebook, underlined it, then continued listening to the meeting. When the meeting ended, she went back to her desk, closed the fake file, opened the real file, and changed every password. From that day on, everything Dennis saw on her screen was something she wanted him to see. Numbers that were correct where it didn't matter, wrong where no one would check, and completely harmless. Dennis read the script Margot wrote every day and reported it back to Barrett every night, without knowing that from the third week on, he had become an actor in her play. Margot didn't tell Sterling. She didn't go up to the top floor and knock on his office door. She didn't ask anyone to pass along a message. She handled it, stayed silent, and continued going to work every morning as though nothing had happened. But Sterling knew. Not from Margot. From his people inside the building, people whose faces Margot didn't know and would never be introduced to. They reported back. Miss Whitfield created a fake file, let Dennis see it, then changed the passwords on all the real files immediately after the meeting. Clean. Fast. No trace left behind. That evening, at the kitchen table in Bridgeport, Sterling was reading the newspaper when Margot finished washing the dishes and was about to go upstairs. He folded the paper, set it down, then said without turning to look at her, "Dennis." One word. Margot stopped. She didn't ask, "What about Dennis?" or "How do you know?" She only stood still and waited. because she knew Sterling wasn't the kind of man who said half a sentence and left it there. "When did you know?" he asked. "The 3rd week," she answered. Sterling was silent for a while. Then he said, his voice unchanged, still as calm as if he were talking about the weather. "You handled it better than half the people I've ever worked with." Margot didn't answer. She gave a small nod, then went up the stairs. But before she reached the last step, she heard Sterling pick up the phone below and say one short sentence to someone on the other end. She couldn't hear it clearly. She didn't need to. The next morning, Dennis didn't come to the office. Not because he was sick, because the night before, Dennis had received a phone call. And that morning, Dennis was sitting in a room on the top floor of the Voss Corporation building, a room he had never been invited into during all 3 years he had worked there. The room had no nameplate on the door, only a long wooden table, one chair behind it, and 2 men standing on either side of the door, silent, motionless, standing the way people stood when they didn't need to explain why they were there. Sterling sat behind the desk. In front of him was an open laptop. Dennis sat across from him, hands on his thighs, his back stiff. Sterling didn't greet him, didn't ask how he was. He turned the laptop toward Dennis and pressed play. From the speaker came a voice, clear, without static, Dennis's voice, reporting over the phone to Barrett about the files Miss Whitfield is working on. Date, time, content, exact. Dennis listened to his own voice echo through that quiet room, and his face turned from white to gray within seconds. Sterling stopped the recording, closed the laptop, looked at Dennis. Not angry, not contemptuous, just looking the way a man looked when he had already decided everything before the meeting began and was now only completing the procedure. "2 choices, Sterling said, his voice flat. 1. Write your resignation letter right now, on this desk, by hand. Leave Chicago before the end of the week. Never mention my name to anyone. Don't come back." Dennis opened his mouth as if to say something. Sterling raised one finger, lightly, without hurry, and Dennis closed his mouth again. 2. Sterling stopped. He didn't continue. Only silence. The silence lasted 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. There was no sound in the room except Dennis's heavy breathing and the clock on the wall. Sterling didn't say the second choice. He didn't need to, because that silence was the second choice, and Dennis understood. Dennis wrote his resignation letter on the sheet of paper one of the 2 men by the door placed in front of him. The pen trembled in his hand. His signature came out crooked, slanting to the right, nothing like the signature Dennis had used on any document before. Sterling looked at the signature, nodded, then folded the paper and set it aside. Dennis stood, his legs a little unsteady. He walked to the door, passed between the 2 men still standing motionless, and when the door closed behind him, Sterling said to one of them, his voice still flat, as if nothing had happened, "Make sure he gets on the plane." The man nodded, didn't ask where the flight was going, didn't ask when, just nodded and stepped out. Sterling sat alone in the room. He opened the laptop, deleted the recording, closed the lid, then stood, walked to the door, turned off the light, took the elevator down, went out to the car, returned to Bridgeport. When he stepped into the kitchen that evening, Mrs. Bellamy had already set dinner, and Margot was sitting at the table reading. No one mentioned Dennis. No one mentioned the top floor. No one mentioned the flight. There was only the sound of a spoon stirring inside a cup of tea and the soft turn of a page, ordinary, like every other evening in Bridgeport. Except from that day on, Barrett Voss had lost his only pair of eyes inside the building, and he didn't know it yet. Barrett lost Dennis and didn't know it. For the first 2 days, he thought Dennis was out sick. On the 3rd day, he called. The phone number couldn't be reached. On the 5th day, he sent someone to Dennis's apartment in Lincoln Park. The apartment was empty. The furniture was still there, but the clothes, the laptop, and the personal documents had disappeared. Dennis had left Chicago without leaving a single message for Barrett. He understood at once what had happened, but he had no way to confirm it, because his only source of information inside the corporation had just vanished. For the next 2 weeks, Barrett operated in the dark. He didn't know what Sterling was doing, didn't know where Margot was looking, didn't know whom Hargrove was meeting. For the first time in 11 years of holding the chairman's seat, Barrett Voss sat in his office on the top floor of the corporate building without knowing what was happening beneath his own feet. While Barrett was losing his direction, Sterling acted. One Thursday evening, 3 weeks after Dennis left Chicago, 4 men came to the Bridgeport house. They came separately, 15 minutes apart, parking on different streets and walking over. No one rang the bell. They knocked on the back door. Mrs. Bellamy opened it, didn't ask anything, and simply led them into the kitchen. She poured coffee for each man, placed the cups in front of them, then stepped out and closed the kitchen door behind her. 4 men sat around the old wooden table, the same table where Sterling fried eggs every Sunday morning. Sterling stood. He didn't sit down. He said, "From now until the end of the month, no one does business with Barrett Voss. No selling, no buying, no taking his calls. If he knocks, don't open. If he calls, don't answer." One of the 4 men, the one sitting closest to the window, asked, "What if he looks for partners outside Chicago?" Sterling answered, his voice unchanged. "I called Detroit yesterday, and New York this morning. No one asked anything else." All 4 nodded. Sterling nodded back. The meeting was over. From the moment Mrs. Bellamy closed the kitchen door to the moment the last man stood, 8 minutes had passed. Margot was upstairs. She heard chairs scraping, unfamiliar footsteps, the back door opening and closing. She didn't go down to the kitchen, but after the 4 men had gone, she stood at the top of the stairs and looked down through the gap in the banister. Sterling stood in the hallway, seeing the last man out through the back door. She saw the handshake. Not a social handshake. The handshake of a man receiving an order and confirming that the order would be carried out. 4 men walked out, 4 identical handshakes, 4 identical nods. Then they disappeared into the night. Sterling stood at the back door for a while, looking out into the yard, then turned back inside. He didn't look up toward the stairs. He didn't know Margot was standing there. Or he did know, but didn't need to confirm it. Margot didn't sleep that night. She lay in her room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what she had just seen. The man who fried eggs on Sunday mornings. The man who fixed a door hinge with a screwdriver. The man who said, "Sit down," then placed a plate in front of her without needing to ask what she wanted to eat. That same man had just stood in the kitchen, spoken 15 words, and cut off the entire cash flow of one of the most powerful men in Chicago, from Chicago to Detroit to New York, in 8 minutes. She had wondered which story was true. Now she knew. Both were true. And that was what kept her awake. The next morning, Sterling came down to the kitchen at 6:30, as he did every day. He poured coffee, set the cup on the table, and pulled out a chair. Margot was already sitting there. She wasn't holding a cup, wasn't holding a book. She was sitting there waiting for him. Sterling looked at her. He understood at once that this morning wasn't like every other morning. He sat down across from her, placed his coffee in front of him, and waited. "Who are you?" Margot asked. 3 words. Her voice was calm, not high, not low. Not the question of someone afraid. The question of someone who needed to know. Sterling looked at her for a while. Then he said, "You knew who I was before we got married." "I knew the rumors," Margot replied. "Yesterday I saw the truth." Silence. Sterling didn't lower his eyes. Margot didn't either. The 2 of them looked at each other across the old wooden table, between 2 cups of coffee, in the small kitchen where early morning light had just begun slipping through the window. Then Sterling spoke, slowly, word by word, not because he was weighing them, but because he wanted her to hear each one clearly. "I'm not a good man. I've never said I was a good man." He paused. "I'm a man who keeps his word. There are things I do that you'll never agree with. There are calls I make that you shouldn't hear. There are people I meet whose names you shouldn't know." He looked at her, without looking away. "But in this house, no one can touch you. Not even me." Margot listened. She didn't nod, didn't shake her head. She let every sentence sink in, the way she let numbers sink in when she read ledgers, not rushing to judge, only recording. Then she said, her voice just as slow, just as clear, just as steady, "I don't need someone to protect me. I protected myself for 8 years in Lenora's house without anyone." She stopped. "I need someone to be truthful with me." Sterling looked at her. He didn't smile, didn't nod, but something in his eyes changed, slightly, almost invisibly, like a door opening just enough to let light slip through, but not enough to see the room inside. He said, "Then I was just truthful with you." No one said anything more. Sterling lifted his coffee and drank. Margot pulled her own cup closer and drank too. The two of them sat at the kitchen table in silence, a silence different from all the silences that had come before in this house. Before, they had been silent because they hadn't known what to say. This time, they were silent because enough had been said, and both of them understood that after this morning, everything between them had changed. Not because they trusted each other, not yet, but because for the first time, both of them had looked straight at each other, and neither one had looked away. In the old house in Bridgeport, between 2 cups of coffee slowly growing cold, that was the beginning of something neither of them had named yet, but it was there, and it didn't disappear. Barrett Voss wasn't used to sitting in the dark. For all 11 years he had run the Voss Corporation, he had always known everything before it happened. Who signed which contract, who met with whom, who said what behind closed doors. But from the moment Dennis left Chicago, Barrett lost the thing he depended on most. Information. Cash flow was being squeezed from 3 cities. Old partners stopped answering their phones. Calls that used to be returned within 10 minutes now fell into voicemail. Barrett sat in his office on the top floor of the corporate building, looking down at Chicago through the wide sheet of glass, and for the first time, he felt the city turning its back on him. He didn't know exactly what Margot had found in the books. He didn't know what Sterling was planning. He only knew that with each day that passed, he lost another piece of control. And Barrett Voss wasn't the kind of man who accepted losing control, so he did the thing he had been trying to avoid for the past 3 weeks. He stopped working indirectly. No planting another person, no threatening phone calls, no lawyers. He sent people directly. Wednesday evening, Margot got off work later than usual. She stayed in the accounting department until almost 8 o'clock to finish the quarterly reconciliation sheet, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she wanted to check the 3 new accounts she had discovered that week. When she closed her laptop, turned off her desk lamp, and stepped out of the elevator in the basement, the parking garage was almost empty. White neon lights flickered across the low ceiling, and the sound of her footsteps echoed over the concrete floor. Her car was parked in the far corner, near the east exit, where the light was weaker because 2 bulbs had burned out, and no one had replaced them. She walked past the 3rd concrete pillar when she saw them. 2 men standing beside her car, not leaning, not sitting, standing, waiting. Margot stopped. Her first instinct was to turn back. But she didn't turn. She had lived 8 years in Lenora's house, where turning your back on a dangerous person only made them think you were weak. She kept walking. Slower now, but she didn't stop. When she was about 5 meters from the car, one of the 2 men stepped out to block her path. The other moved around to the side and yanked the purse from her shoulder. Fast, clean, the kind of grab made by someone who had done this many times. He opened the purse, searched through each compartment, dumped things into his hand, looking. Wallet, keys, phone, lipstick, a small notebook, no USB drive, no hard drive, nothing he needed to find. Margot looked straight into the face of the man searching her purse. She said, her voice clear, not loud, but carrying through the empty parking garage. "You won't find it. I'm not stupid enough to carry it on me." The man searching the purse stopped and looked at her. The man blocking her path stepped closer, close enough that she could smell tobacco on his jacket. Then the elevator bell rang behind them. All 3 turned. The elevator doors opened. Sterling stepped out. Behind him were 2 men, close, silent. Sterling didn't run, didn't shout. He walked out of the elevator as if he were walking into his own living room. Calm, certain, each step sounding evenly against the concrete. He stopped 3 meters from Margot. Looked at the 2 men, didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The 2 men looked at Sterling Voss, standing 3 meters away, with the 2 men behind him standing still like shadows, and they understood at once who they were standing in front of. In Chicago's underground business world, there were names that needed no explanation. Sterling Voss was one of those names. The man searching the purse dropped it to the ground. The man blocking the path stepped back, then both of them turned and walked quickly toward the exit at the far end of the parking garage. Not running, because running meant admitting fear, but fast enough for Sterling to understand they had no intention of coming back. Sterling waited until the sound of their footsteps disappeared completely. Then he stepped forward, bent down, and picked up Margot's purse. He gathered the things that had spilled out, put them back inside, zipped it closed, and handed it to her. His hand was steady. His eyes moved over her in a quick check, and he didn't ask whether she was all right because he could see she was standing firmly, her eyes still sharp, and he already knew the answer. He said, "From now on, you don't go to the parking garage alone." It wasn't an order. His voice was ordinary, the same voice he had used when he said, "Sit down," and placed a plate of eggs in front of her on that first Sunday morning in Bridgeport. But Margot understood. This was Sterling Voss saying that this would not happen a second time. They got into the car. Sterling drove. As the car left the parking garage, he took out his phone, pressed a number, waited 2 seconds, then said 3 words, "Find out who." Then he hung up. No explanation of whom he had called. No explanation of what he would do. Margot sat in the passenger seat, looking straight ahead, her purse on her lap. She didn't ask, because she had come to understand that in Sterling's world, there were questions whose answers arrived not in words, but in results. The results came that same week. The 2 men from the parking garage left Chicago. No one saw them return. Margot didn't ask where they went. Sterling didn't say. And Mrs. Bellamy, when Margot walked into the kitchen that night near 10 o'clock, didn't ask where she had been. Didn't ask what had happened. Didn't ask whether she was afraid. She simply placed a bowl of hot porridge in front of Margot on the kitchen table, set a spoon beside it, then went back to her room. Not a word. Margot sat down, picked up the spoon, finished the whole bowl. Her hands didn't tremble. They never had. But that night, when she went upstairs, locked her door, and sat on the bed, she looked down at her 2 hands in the glow of the bedside lamp and thought about the moment the elevator doors opened. She thought about the 3 meters between Sterling and those 2 men. 3 meters he didn't need to close, because 3 meters was already enough. She had protected herself for 8 years in Lenora's house. She had told Sterling she didn't need someone to protect her, and she still believed that. But tonight, for the first time, she understood something else too. Not needing a protector and having someone willing to protect you were 2 different things. And the second one didn't make her weaker. It only made the empty space behind her back, the empty space Sterling had seen at City Hall that day, feel a little less empty. While the lobby lawyer was working on the Gold Coast file, Barrett didn't sit still. He had lost his cash flow, lost his eyes and ears, lost his patience, but he still had one thing left: the chairman's seat. On paper, Barrett Voss was still the chairman of the board of the Voss Corporation. Sterling hadn't removed him, hadn't sued, hadn't made any public legal move at all. That meant Barrett still had the authority to sign internal orders, still had the authority to approve personnel decisions, still had the authority to move any employee in the corporation to any department he wanted, and he used that authority. On Monday morning at the start of the week, Margot came to the office as she did every day. She turned on her computer, entered her password, and a notice from Human Resources appeared on the screen. By decision of the Board of Directors, you are transferred to the General Administration Department as of today. Please contact Human Resources to receive your handover. General Administration, 1st floor, a room with no windows. The work: organizing files, archiving records, and answering internal phone calls. No access to the financial system. No right to view the books. No right to touch any number at all. Barrett had cut her away from the data cleanly, neatly, legally on paper. An ordinary personnel decision no one could sue over, because the chairman had the right to transfer employees and didn't need to explain why. Margot read the notice. Read it again. Then she turned off the screen, stood, and cleared her desk. She didn't call Sterling, didn't call Hargrove, didn't object to Human Resources. She knew this was Barrett's move, and she knew a public reaction was exactly what Barrett wanted to see. She carried her box of personal things down to the 1st floor, sat at her new desk, and began organizing archived files, as though that was the work she had done all her life. But in her mind, she was taking inventory. Everything she needed, she already had. The data from the past 3 months had been saved. The passwords had been changed before Barrett could issue the order to revoke her access. Barrett had closed the door after the horse had already left the stable. That same day, Barrett called Lenora. He didn't call to ask how she was. He called because he needed one more front, and Lenora was the cheapest tool he had. "Come down to Chicago," he said. "Talk to the girl. Remind her who she is and where she came from." Lenora didn't ask why. She took the bus from the suburbs down to Chicago the next afternoon. Lenora called Margot and arranged to meet at a cafe near the corporate building. Margot came, not because she wanted to see Lenora, but because she wanted to hear what the woman had to say. She wanted to know what Barrett was thinking, and Lenora was the clearest mirror of whatever Barrett had ordered. Lenora was already seated when Margot arrived. She had ordered 2 cups of coffee, pushed one toward Margot, then began speaking in that gentle voice Margot had heard for 8 years, the kind of gentleness with a blade hidden inside it. "You're living well," Lenora said. "A nice house, a rich husband, a steady job, better than anything you could have had without me." She took a sip of coffee. "You should be grateful. Don't bother people. Don't stick your nose into things that aren't yours." She looked at Margot with the expression Margot had seen thousands of times, the look of someone who believed Margot would lower her head because she had always lowered her head, because she had no other choice, because for the past 8 years she had never talked back once. Margot looked at the cup of coffee Lenora had ordered for her. She didn't drink. She looked up, looked straight into Lenora's eyes, and for the first time in 8 years, she talked back. "I'm not bothering anyone." Margot's voice was calm, not loud, not trembling, not angry. Calm in a way Lenora had never heard from her before, because Lenora had never given her the chance to speak in that voice. "I'm only doing my job correctly." Lenora opened her mouth to say more, but Margot had already stood. She pushed in her chair, gently, without making a sound. She turned and walked out of the cafe without looking back. She didn't need to look back, because Margot knew exactly what expression was on Lenora's face now, the expression of someone who had just said the sentence she was certain would work, only to watch the person across from her stand up and leave as if she had been speaking to a wall. Lenora sat alone in the cafe, in front of 2 cups of coffee, one untouched, like the glass of whiskey Sterling had left on the table at Gold Coast the night before. In this family, the things people left on tables when they walked away were beginning to become messages. But Barrett didn't only use Lenora. The real blow came at the end of that week. Hargrove called Sterling on Friday night, the old man's voice calm, but heavier than usual. "They're reopening the Gold Coast file," he said. "A lobby lawyer is pushing for a reinvestigation. The reason? New circumstances." Sterling didn't answer right away. Hargrove continued. "If they reinvestigate and find a pretext, you could be prosecuted a second time. Everything we've built over the past 6 months will stop." Sterling hung up. He sat in the small study on the first floor of the Bridgeport house, the room that had once been his mother's reading room. A wooden desk, a desk lamp, stacks of papers Hargrove sent over every week. He sat there with both hands resting on the desk, doing nothing. Not calling anyone, not opening any file, not planning, just sitting. Margot passed the study at 10 o'clock that night on her way upstairs. The door was slightly open. She looked in and saw Sterling sitting behind the desk, motionless, the desk lamp lighting half his face while the other half stayed in shadow. He wasn't looking at the files, wasn't looking at his phone. He was staring straight ahead into empty space, with the look of someone who had been fighting too long and had just taken a blow he hadn't expected. For the first time since Margot had stepped into this house, she saw Sterling Voss look like an ordinary person, not the man who made the whole city go silent when he spoke, not the man who left an untouched glass of whiskey on the table and walked away without looking back. Just a man sitting alone in his study at 10 o'clock at night, exhausted, with no one he knew how to tell. 2 years without freedom, 6 months of fighting since he walked out, and now Barrett was dragging him back to the starting line, back to the place where everything began, back to Gold Coast, back to that corner table, back to the night everything had been stolen from him. Margot stood at the door for 3 more seconds. Then she walked away, went up the stairs, and entered her room. She didn't knock on his door and ask whether he was all right, didn't bring him a cup of tea, didn't offer any words of comfort, because Margot wasn't the kind of person who comforted with words. She was the kind of person who acted. And that night, lying in her room, staring at the ceiling, she began to think. Not about feelings, about numbers, about cash flow, about the night at Gold Coast, about the question whose answer, she knew, was somewhere inside the files she had been saving for the past 3 months. Barrett had staged the Gold Coast incident. There had been a man who caused trouble. There had been false witnesses. There had been police arriving early. All of those things required money, and money always left a trace. Margot was an accountant, and if there was one thing good accountants did better than anyone else in the world, it was finding the trail of money. The next morning, Margot didn't wait for Sterling to come down to the kitchen. She knocked on the door of his study at 6 o'clock in the morning. Sterling was awake, sitting in the same position where she had seen him the night before, as if he had never left that chair at all. The coffee on the desk had gone cold long ago. He looked up when she opened the door, not surprised, not asking what she needed. Margot stepped inside, pulled a chair from the corner of the room, placed it across from him, and sat down. She didn't ask whether he was all right, didn't say, "Don't worry," didn't touch his hand. She spoke directly, her voice clear, the same voice she had used when reading Lenora's books for 8 years, the kind of voice with no room for emotion because work didn't need emotion. "The Gold Coast case. You were set up. I need you to tell me exactly what happened that night. Every detail. Don't leave anything out." Sterling looked at her. For a long time. Not the kind of look that judged, but the kind of look of someone deciding whether to open a door he had kept locked for 2 years. Then he opened it. He told her, from the beginning, the charity fundraiser on Saturday night, 200 guests, him arriving alone because Hargrove had advised him to appear in order to maintain the corporation's image. He sat at the table on the east side, near the window. Around 9:45, a man he had never met before walked up to his table, began speaking loudly, provoking him, calling him by name, saying things about his father that only someone who had been coached beforehand would know. Sterling stood. Before he could say a single word, the man shoved into him, fell, and 3 witnesses nearby all shouted at once that Sterling had attacked him. The police arrived within 4 minutes. 4 minutes, in Gold Coast, on a Saturday night, faster than any emergency call should have been, because they had been called in advance. Sterling stopped there. He didn't talk about the 2 years after that. He didn't need to. Margot understood the rest. She asked more questions. Questions Sterling hadn't expected to hear from her. Not, "Are you all right?" or "Were you angry?" but, "How did the man who provoked you arrive? Taxi? Private car? Or was he brought there? Where were the 3 witnesses sitting before it happened? Who called the police? And from what phone number?" Questions from an accountant. Questions from someone looking for the trail of money. Sterling answered what he knew. What he didn't know, he said plainly, "I don't know," and Margot wrote it down. It took her 4 days. 4 days sitting in the second-floor room of the Bridgeport house with her laptop and all the data she had gathered over 3 months working at the Voss Corporation, along with 8 years of data from Lenora's 2 real estate offices. She started with the simplest question. On the night of Gold Coast, who paid? The man who caused the trouble wasn't one of Barrett's people. He was an outsider, hired for the job. Hired meant there had been a transaction. Margot searched through the Voss Corporation's books, around the period 2 weeks before the Gold Coast night, looking for an unusual expense. She found it. $15,000, transferred to an individual through an intermediary account she had marked during her first week at work, one of the 3 shell companies. The money had gone from the Voss Corporation, through the shell company in Detroit, to a personal account. She looked up the account holder's name. It matched the name of the man who had caused the trouble at Gold Coast in the police file Hargrove had saved. The false witnesses, 3 people. Margot found 3 other payments, from the same period, also routed through the shell company, sent to 3 different personal accounts, smaller amounts, $5,000 each. Enough to buy testimony, not enough to draw attention. The police call. Margot couldn't find directly who had placed the call, but she found something else. The intermediary account Barrett had used to pay the provocateur and the false witnesses didn't belong only to the Voss Corporation. It was a shared account. And the co-owner was Lenora Whitfield, the same account Lenora had used for the real estate transactions Margot had recorded for 8 years in that house. Barrett had exposed the trail from the Gold Coast night through the very channel he shared with Lenora, and Margot, the person who had read every number that passed through Lenora's hands for 8 years, recognized it immediately. The evidence that Barrett had staged the Gold Coast incident was sitting inside the data Barrett himself had exposed through Lenora. Margot hadn't spent 8 years keeping records in that storage room because she knew this day would come. She recorded things because it was the habit of the profession. But that habit had just saved Sterling Voss. On the 5th day, Margot met Hargrove at the law office in the Loop. She brought all the data with her. Not one small USB drive like the one she had hidden in the storage room. A complete file system, with transaction codes, dates, amounts, names, addresses, and a money trail connecting Barrett through the shell company to every person involved in the Gold Coast night. She placed the laptop in front of Hargrove, opened each file, and explained every connection in the voice of someone used to presenting books to an auditor. Hargrove listened. He read. He checked several numbers with the handheld calculator he still used, even though the world had moved to Excel 20 years earlier. When she finished presenting, he sat still for a while. Then he looked at her over his reading glasses and asked, "You found all of this by yourself?" Margot answered, her voice unchanged. "I'm an accountant. That's my job." Hargrove said nothing more. He nodded, slowly, the kind of nod from a man who had lived 68 years and could still be surprised by someone 40 years younger than himself. He sent the entire file to the federal authorities that same day. 1 week later, the request to reinvestigate the Gold Coast case was canceled, not because there wasn't enough basis, but because the file Hargrove submitted showed that the Gold Coast case wasn't a case that needed to be reinvestigated in the same direction, but a case that needed to be investigated in reverse. The person who needed to be prosecuted wasn't Sterling. It was Barrett. The FBI opened a new file, adding the evidence Margot had provided to the growing list of opaque transactions involving Barrett Voss. Barrett's final blow had just been broken, and the person who broke it wasn't Sterling, wasn't Hargrove, wasn't the legal team or the underground network stretching across 3 cities. It was a girl from her stepmother's storage room, with an old laptop and 8 years of the habit of recording every number no one had bothered to ask about. That evening, Sterling returned to Bridgeport later than usual. Hargrove had called him that afternoon to tell him the FBI had canceled the reinvestigation and opened a new file against Barrett. He knew what Margot had done. He knew it from Hargrove, not from her, because Margot didn't say anything. She didn't tell the story. She didn't wait for him to thank her. When Sterling stepped into the house near 10 o'clock, Margot was in the kitchen, washing dishes, the sink, running water, the soft clink of plates and bowls touching. Mrs. Bellamy had gone to bed. The house was quiet. Sterling stood in the kitchen doorway. He didn't step in right away. He stood there, one shoulder leaning against the frame, watching Margot wash the dishes. Her back was turned to him. She didn't know he was standing there, or she did know, but didn't turn around, because Margot wasn't the kind of person who turned around just to check who was watching her. Sterling stepped into the kitchen. Slowly, he stopped beside Margot, on her left, half a step away. He didn't say anything. Didn't say, "Thank you." Didn't say, "You saved me." Didn't say anything at all. He only reached out, took the bowl Margot was still washing from her hands, gently, then continued washing it, water running, soap bubbles on his hands. He washed that bowl, placed it on the rack, then picked up the next one. Margot looked over. He didn't look back. His eyes stayed on the sink, his hands washing each dish slowly, carefully, the way a man washed dishes when he had never washed them beside anyone else before, and was learning how to do it without needing instructions. Margot turned her eyes forward again. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The two of them stood side by side in front of the sink, in the small kitchen in Bridgeport, washing dishes, silent, while outside, an entire empire was shaking, and a powerful man was sitting in his study at 3 o'clock in the morning, watching the world he had built over 11 years begin to collapse. But in this kitchen, there was no empire, no cash flow, no Gold Coast, only running water, soap bubbles, and 2 people standing beside each other without walking away. The night before Hargrove sent the final file to the FBI, the night before everything began moving in a way no one could stop, Margot sat on the back steps of the Bridgeport house, alone. 9 o'clock at night, and the October air in Chicago had already begun to turn cold. The kind of cold not yet sharp enough for a heavy coat, but enough to tell you winter was coming. She sat on the concrete step, both arms wrapped around her knees, looking out at the small backyard. The wild apple tree had shed almost all its leaves. The clothesline was empty, with only 2 wooden clothespins still clinging to the middle. The neighbor's light beyond the fence had gone out, quiet. She heard the back door open. She didn't turn around. Footsteps on the concrete, then Sterling sat down beside her. Not too close, with just enough space between them, the kind of distance the two of them had grown used to keeping over the past months, not far enough to become cold, not close enough to become something neither of them was ready to name. He had brought 2 cans of beer. He handed one to her. Margot took it, but didn't open it. Sterling didn't open his either. The 2 cold beer cans rested in their hands, and neither of them drank. They sat in silence for a while, the familiar silence of Bridgeport, but tonight it was heavier than usual, because both of them knew tomorrow everything would change. Margot didn't ask about the file, didn't ask about the FBI, didn't ask whether Sterling was ready. She knew he had been ready 2 years ago. From the moment he placed the hard drive on Hargrove's desk, and accepted stepping into a room 3 square meters wide. Sterling was the first to speak. Not about Barrett, not about tomorrow. He spoke about his mother. "My mother lived in a very large house," he said, his voice lower than usual, slower, like a man opening a drawer he rarely touched. "A large house, a wide garden, 3 floors, enough rooms for 10 people to live there without meeting one another in the hallway. But my mother was never allowed to decide anything for herself in that house. Not what to eat, not where to go, not whom to see." He stopped. "She passed away when I was 22. Lung disease. 2 months in the hospital. I stayed beside her every day. Margot didn't speak. She only listened. Before she died, she said one thing to me." Sterling looked out at the yard, at the apple tree stripped bare. She said, "Home isn't a place with walls. Home is where you get to be yourself." He fell silent. Then he added, softly, almost as if speaking to himself, "I kept this house because of that sentence. Not because it's beautiful, not because it's big, because this was the only place where my mother was ever allowed to be herself." Margot understood then. She understood why Sterling Voss, a man who could buy any house in Chicago, lived in a 2-story brick house with peeling paint in Bridgeport. She understood why he fixed door hinges by hand, why he fried eggs on Sunday mornings, why he kept 2 separate rooms at opposite ends of the hallway and never entered hers without knocking. He wasn't keeping a house. He was keeping a promise to his mother, that wherever he lived, no one there would be controlled. Not even the wife he hadn't chosen, and who hadn't been allowed to choose him either. They sat for a while longer. Then Margot asked, without turning to look at him, her eyes still on the yard, "If none of this had happened, if Barrett hadn't set you up, if Lenora hadn't married me off, do you think we ever would have met?" Sterling didn't answer right away. He sat still, the cold can of beer in his hand, his breath forming a faint mist in the October air. Then he said, slowly, word by word, in the voice of a man who wasn't used to talking about feelings but was trying because the person sitting beside him deserved the truth. "I don't know, but I know one thing. I wouldn't want to be the man I am now without you sitting here." Margot didn't answer. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because that sentence didn't need an answer. It needed to be heard, and she had heard it. She opened the can of beer, took a sip. Sterling looked over, then opened his own can too. Drank. They sat beside each other on the concrete steps, drinking beer in silence, looking at the small backyard and the bare apple tree. No one said anything more. No one needed to say anything more. And Margot realized something. For the first time, not with her mind, not with logic, not with numbers. She realized it with something she wasn't used to using and didn't know how to name. For 8 years in Lenora's house, silence had been something she endured. Silence when Lenora gave orders. Silence when Paige mocked her. Silence when she handed over her paycheck envelope on the 5th of every month. Silence because even if she spoke, no one would listen, because saying nothing was safer than speaking. But tonight, sitting on the Bridgeport steps beside the man who had just told her about his mother in a voice she was certain he had never used with anyone else, silence wasn't something she was enduring. It was something she chose. And that was the difference it had taken 8 years. A marriage no one wanted, and an October night in Chicago for her to understand. Tomorrow, the file would reach the FBI. Tomorrow, everything would begin falling apart for Barrett Voss. Tomorrow, the world would know the truth. But tonight, on the back steps of the Bridgeport house, there was no tomorrow. There were only 2 cans of beer, 2 people, and a silence that, for the first time in her life, Margot didn't want to break. Wednesday morning. The Chicago sky was clear, the sunlight pale. The kind of ordinary morning in the middle of a work week that no one expected to be different from any other day. Employees of the Voss Corporation arrived at the office at 8 o'clock, as they always did. The elevators were crowded. There was a long line at the coffee machine on the 3rd floor. The large conference room on the 12th floor was being prepared for the regular board meeting at 9 o'clock. Barrett sat at the head of the table, papers arranged in front of him, an ink pen lying parallel to the edge of the table, a pitcher of water already poured. He opened the meeting on time, his voice ordinary, the content ordinary, the 3rd quarter report, the 4th quarter plan, the budget allocation. At 9:17, the conference room door opened. Not a secretary, not an assistant. 4 people walked in, dark suits, federal badges hanging on their chests. The person in front held a stack of papers and handed it to Barrett without sitting down. Mr. Barrett Voss. Federal search warrant. We require your cooperation. The entire 10th and 12th floors will be sealed off until the process is complete. Barrett took the papers and read the first line. His eyes didn't change. His jaw didn't tighten. He had lived long enough in this world to know that any reaction in front of federal agents would be written into the record. He set the papers down, folded his glasses, slipped them into his jacket pocket, and said to the board members in the same ordinary voice, "The meeting is temporarily adjourned." Then he stood and followed the 4 agents out of the room. At the same time, in Bridgeport, Sterling was kneeling in front of the kitchen door. The top hinge had been loose since the week before, making the door creak every time it opened. He had meant to fix it since Monday, but hadn't had time. This morning, he had time. The toolbox was open beside him, a screwdriver in his hand. 3 new screws lying on the floor. He removed the old hinge, installed the new one, and tightened each screw. Slow, steady, the way a man worked when he wasn't in a hurry because he knew everything that needed to happen had already been arranged. His phone rang at 9:23. He set the screwdriver down, pulled the phone from his pocket, and looked at the screen. "Hargrove," he answered. "It's done." Hargrove's voice was brief, calm, the kind of calm of a man who had waited 2 years for this moment and didn't need to shout when it arrived. "Good," Sterling said. One word. Then he hung up, put the phone back in his pocket, picked up the screwdriver, and tightened the last screw into the hinge. He closed the kitchen door, opened it, closed it again. No creak. He gave a small nod, put away the toolbox, stood, and washed his hands at the sink. "Mrs." Bellamy passed through the kitchen, looked at the repaired door, and said, "It doesn't creak anymore?" Sterling nodded. She nodded back, then kept walking. No one in that kitchen mentioned the FBI, Barrett, or the corporation. Ordinary, like every Wednesday morning in Bridgeport. Inside the Voss corporate building, nothing was ordinary. The 10th and 12th floors were sealed. Employees were asked to leave the area. Federal agents opened every cabinet, collected every hard drive, marked every box of files. And on the 3rd floor, in a small conference room normally used only for job interviews, Margot sat on one side of the table. Across from her were 2 FBI agents. Beside her was Hargrove, his old leather briefcase open on the table. Inside it, a copy of the file he had sent to the federal authorities the week before. The lead agent, a middle-aged woman with short hair and sharp eyes, the kind of eyes belonging to someone who had read thousands of statements and knew the difference between a person telling the truth and a person following a script, opened her laptop, pulled up a spreadsheet, then looked at Margot. This file compiles data from multiple sources: internal corporate accounts, outside personal accounts, real estate transactions connected to Mrs. Lenora Whitfield, and the money trail related to the incident at Gold Coast 2 years ago. She paused. Who compiled this reconciliation data? Hargrove, without looking up, gestured lightly toward Margot. She did. The agent looked at Margot, looked more carefully. A 27-year-old woman sitting in a small conference room on the 3rd floor. White blouse, hair tied neatly back, spine straight, hands resting on the table. Calm. She didn't look like a lawyer. Didn't look like an investigator. Didn't look like anyone the agent usually saw in federal-level financial fraud cases. "What department do you work in?" the agent asked. "I'm an accountant," Margot answered, her voice even, unhurried. "Before this, I worked at a small company in the South Loop." The agent took notes. "And before that?" Margot stopped. Half a second. Then she said, her voice unchanged, still level, still calm, though Hargrove, sitting beside her, heard something in that half-second pause that the agent did not. "Before that, I was in my stepmother's storage room." The agent looked at her, not understanding. She wrote "storage room" in her notebook, placed a question mark beside it, then continued with the next question about the data reconciliation method. She didn't understand why an accountant would mention her stepmother's storage room during a federal interview. She would never understand, because to understand that sentence, one had to know about 8 years of handing over a paycheck in a white envelope on the 5th of every month, about the old laptop opened at 2 o'clock in the morning, about the USB drive hidden inside a tampon box, about the windowless room, the sheet she had bought herself, the flattened pillow no one replaced, about the 27-year-old woman sitting here today, across from federal agents, answering every question in the calm voice of someone who had waited for this moment not because she wanted revenge, but because the truth deserved to be spoken. Hargrove understood. He sat beside Margot, listening as she answered each question, explained each data connection, pointed out each irregular flow of money in a professional voice he knew no school could truly teach, a voice that had taken 8 years of reading books in the dark to acquire. He said nothing, but at some point during the interview, he turned away, took off his glasses, and used the hem of his jacket to clean the lenses. Slowly, carefully, longer than usual. Then he put the glasses back on and continued listening. In front of the corporate building, Barrett Voss was led through the main entrance by 2 agents. No handcuffs, because this was the search phase, not an official arrest. But the federal vehicle was parked right outside the door, and the entire staff stood in the lobby watching the chairman of the board step into the car under the Wednesday morning sunlight. Ordinary as any other day, except nothing here was ordinary anymore. That same afternoon, FBI agents went to Lenora's house in the Chicago suburbs. She was questioned on the spot. Dirty real estate transactions tied to Barrett, the shared account, the money flowing through the 2 small offices on the south side, all of it left traces leading back to her. Lenora sat in her own living room, in front of 2 agents, and for the first time in her life, she didn't have an answer prepared. That evening, Margot's phone rang. Paige. It was the first time Paige had called Margot in months. Margot answered. Paige cried. Not the kind of crying that came from pain, the kind that came from panic, from someone who had just seen the world she had lived inside for 25 years begin to crack and didn't know where to stand. Margot listened, didn't interrupt, didn't comfort her. When Paige stopped to breathe, Margot said, her voice calm, not cold, not warm, only practical. You should find a lawyer. Then she hung up, set the phone down on the table, looked out the window of her second-floor room in the Bridgeport house, out at the dark backyard, the bare apple tree, the concrete steps where she had sat drinking beer with Sterling the night before and listened to him talk about his mother. Downstairs, Sterling was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. The repaired kitchen door opened and closed smoothly. Mrs. Bellamy washed the dishes, the water running softly. Ordinary, like every evening. Except from today on, Barrett Voss no longer sat at the head of the 12th floor conference room table. And the girl from the storage room, the girl Barrett had bought with a cleared debt and Lenora had sold with a nod, the girl no one in that room thought would ever dare open her mouth, had just sat across from federal agents and told them exactly where the money had gone, in a calm voice, with her back straight and her hands steady. From the storage room to the FBI conference room, 8 years, that was the distance. 2 weeks after the day the FBI came to the Voss Corporation building, Lenora was indicted. Financial fraud, complicity in opaque transactions, false tax filings. She was held at a federal detention facility west of Chicago, waiting for her court date. Margot heard the news from Hargrove, not from the press. He called her in the afternoon, his voice as brief as always, telling her that Lenora had been taken into custody that morning and that her appointed lawyer would file a bail request within the week. Margot listened, thanked him, and hung up. She said nothing to Sterling that evening. He didn't ask either. But the next morning, when Margot came down to the kitchen at 6 o'clock, she saw Sterling's car keys lying on the table beside the cup of coffee he had already poured for her. He didn't tell her where she should go. He only left the keys there and let her decide for herself. Margot drove to the detention facility at 10 o'clock in the morning. The parking lot was small, the sun harsh, the concrete walls gray. She sat in the car for 5 minutes before stepping out, not because she was afraid, because she was thinking about what she wanted to ask. She had known the question since the night before, from the moment she lay in her second-floor room in the Bridgeport house and stared at the ceiling. But knowing the question and being ready to hear the answer were 2 different things. She stepped out of the car, closed the door, and went inside. The visitation room was small, with a metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs on either side, white neon lights on the ceiling, and no windows. Lenora was let in after 3 minutes. She was wearing prison clothes, gray, too loose at the shoulders. No makeup. Her hair was tangled and unpinned, the kind of hair Margot had never seen in 8 years of living with her, because Lenora never left her bedroom without brushing her hair neatly and putting on lipstick. But here, there was no lipstick, no large mirror, no Paige carrying coffee up to her room, no Margot handing over a paycheck envelope on the 5th day of every month. Only a metal table, neon light, and two women sitting across from each other. Lenora looked at Margot. Her eyes were different. Not the controlling eyes Margot had seen for 8 years, the kind of eyes belonging to someone who knew she was holding the knife by the right end. Her eyes were smaller now, more tired, the eyes of someone who hadn't slept for many nights and didn't know where to look when there was nothing left to control. "You came here to laugh at me?" Lenora said. Her voice was still sharp, but sharp like a blade gone dull, still being used because its owner had no other knife. "No," Margot replied. Silence. Lenora looked at her and waited. Margot didn't rush. She placed both hands on the table, looked back at Lenora, and let the silence stretch for a few more seconds. Not because she wanted to create pressure, but because the question she was about to ask needed space. It needed a little emptiness before being released, the way people take a deep breath before diving underwater. "Then what did you come for?" Lenora asked, her voice lower now. Margot looked at her, looked at the bare face without lipstick, the tangled hair, the hands resting on the metal table, the left hand with a crease at the middle knuckle where she usually wore the ring that had now been taken away. And Margot asked, "I want to ask one question." Her voice was calm, slow, each word clear. 8 years. Was there ever a moment when you truly cared about me? Even just once. The visitation room was so quiet that Margot could hear the faint hum of the neon light overhead. Lenora didn't answer. Not the kind of refusal that came from contempt or indifference. The kind of silence that came from someone who had just been asked a question, for which she had no prepared answer, no layer to wrap around it, no way to make it sound less heavy. Her eyes dropped to the table, to her own hands, to the crease on the middle knuckle. Then she spoke. Her voice was smaller than any voice Margot had ever heard from her in 8 years, smaller than the voice that gave orders in the morning, smaller than the voice that listed faults at night, smaller than the voice that said, "I'm busy," over the phone on the morning of the wedding, so small that Margot had to lean forward slightly to hear it clearly. "The first year," Lenora said. "When you first came, you looked too much like your father." She stopped, swallowed. "I couldn't bear it." Those last 7 words. "I couldn't bear it." Margot heard each word fall into the space between them. She didn't say, "I cared about you." She said, "I couldn't bear it." Because Margot looked like her father. Because looking at Margot meant seeing the man Lenora had lost, or perhaps had never truly had. And instead of loving her, Lenora chose the easier path. She turned Margot into something she could use instead of something she had to love. Because loving a child who looked like the dead husband was too painful. Using her didn't hurt at all. Margot stood. Slowly. She pushed in the chair. Gently. Without making a sound. She didn't say, "I forgive you." Didn't say, "I understand." Didn't say, "I hate you." Didn't say anything. Because there was nothing to say. The answer wasn't the one she had wanted to hear. But it was true. And Margot had lived with Lenora long enough to know that truth from her was rarer than almost anything else in the world. Sometimes truth didn't heal. It only helped a person stop asking. She turned away and walked out of the visitation room. Down the hallway, through security, through the lobby, out into the sunlight, the parking lot, the car. She opened the door, sat in the driver's seat, and closed it. She placed her hands on the steering wheel. Then she did nothing. Didn't start the engine, didn't drive away, didn't call anyone, didn't cry. She sat still in the car, both hands on the wheel, eyes looking straight through the windshield at the empty parking lot and the gray concrete wall beyond it. 10 minutes. She sat like that for 10 minutes, not thinking of anything specific, or thinking of too many things at once, so many that they canceled one another out and became silence. Then she started the engine, fastened her seatbelt, shifted into gear, drove out of the parking lot, turned left onto the main road, merged into Chicago's midday traffic, drove back to Bridgeport, back to the 2-story red brick house, back to the kitchen door that had been repaired and no longer creaked, back to the concrete steps behind the house and the bare apple tree, back to the place Sterling's mother had called home. The place Margot, after 8 years in a storage room, after a marriage no one wanted, after one question and one answer in a detention center visitation room, finally began to call by that name too. Not because the house was beautiful, not because the man inside it was powerful, but because there, for the first time, she was allowed to be herself, and no one forced her to be anyone else. 6 months passed. Not quickly, not slowly, They pass the way time passes when life begins to carry real weight, when each day is no longer something to endure, but something to live. Margot was appointed Director of Internal Audit at the Voss Corporation. The new board of directors reviewed her file for 2 weeks, her master's degree in finance, her practical experience, and the data analysis ability that federal agents had confirmed in their report. No one on the board voted for her because she was Sterling's wife. They voted for her because they couldn't find anyone better. And because anyone better, if such a person existed, still wouldn't have had 8 years of reading ledgers in the dark to sharpen their eyes until not a single number could slip past them. Barrett Voss was awaiting trial. Financial fraud, opaque transactions, coercion, false reporting, 3 different legal teams, each billing by the hour, and not one of them could make 35 years of records disappear, records Hargrove had kept in a locked room in Lincoln Park. Lenora was waiting for court in the suburbs, out on bail under the condition that she not leave the city. Paige left Chicago by bus, with 1 suitcase, without telling anyone. No one had heard from her since. Hargrove retired. Sterling bought him a small house in the western suburbs, near the hills, with a garden and a white wooden fence he could repaint in the spring if he wanted to. Not repayment, not obligation. Because it was the right thing to do. Because Hargrove had held a paper bomb for 2 years, in 68-year-old hands that trembled but stayed steady, so justice could arrive exactly where it needed to go. That deserved more than a handshake. One Sunday evening in April, the back steps of the Bridgeport house. The wild apple tree had put out new leaves, tender green, the kind of green only early spring in Chicago could have. So fresh it looked as though it had never lived through any winter at all. Margot sat on the steps, in the same place where she had sat the night before the FBI came. The same concrete step, the same backyard. But everything was different. Sterling stepped out through the back door, holding 2 cups. He handed one to her. Margot looked down. Ice cream. She looked up at him. Ice cream? Sterling sat down beside her, keeping the same distance they had grown used to, though tonight it seemed a little closer. He shrugged. Hargrove said I should try living normally. I think normal people eat ice cream on Sunday nights. Margot laughed. Softly, not loudly. Not the kind of laugh people gave for politeness or courtesy. A real laugh, the kind that pulled at the muscles of the face before the mind could decide whether laughing was allowed. The sound was short and light, but it rang through the small backyard in Bridgeport like something new, something this house had never heard from her before. Mrs. Bellamy stood in the kitchen doorway. She looked out and saw the 2 of them sitting on the steps, 2 cups of ice cream in their hands, Margot laughing and Sterling looking at her laugh with an expression Mrs. Bellamy already understood but had never spoken aloud. She looked for 1 more second. Then she turned back inside, closed the kitchen door gently, without making a sound. Not because she didn't care, because she knew some moments didn't need a third person. The following week, Margot happened to read an article on a local Southside news page. A support center for women facing difficult family circumstances had just celebrated 5 years of operation. The center was named Catherine Voss, Sterling's mother. The article mentioned an anonymous donor who had funded the center from its first day and continued supporting it every year without ever appearing at a single event. Margot finished reading, then set down her phone. She didn't ask Sterling. He had never mentioned that center, and she understood that there were things people did not, so anyone would know, but because of a promise to someone who had left, a promise that needed no reminder to be kept. Some people are treated like a burden their whole lives, looked through as though they don't exist. Used, then forgotten, until one day, the world is forced to admit that they were the only ones holding everything together. Margot Whitfield didn't change. She was still the person who woke early, took careful notes, and looked straight into the eyes of the person across from her when everyone around her decided she had no choice. What changed was the world around her, because in the end, if a person never collapses, never becomes what others try to turn her into, the world has no choice but to look directly at her, instead of looking through her as though she had never been there. This story isn't only about Margot. It is about anyone reading this who has ever been underestimated. Anyone who has ever had someone mistake silence for surrender, patience for weakness, endurance for accepting defeat. The lesson here isn't to wait for someone like Sterling to appear and save you. The lesson is this: become the person who is ready when the opportunity comes. Margot wasn't rescued. She prepared herself for 8 years, in the dark, with the truth she recorded when no one asked her to. And when the light arrived, she was already standing exactly where she needed to stand. A person's worth is not in where they begin. It is in what they keep when everything around them tries to take it all away. Margot kept the truth, and the truth brought her here. If this story touched you, please press like to support us as we continue bringing meaningful stories every day. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it, because sometimes the right story at the right moment can change the way a person sees themselves. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel. Please leave a comment sharing what is deep in your heart, because every comment from you is the greatest motivation for us to keep telling stories worth telling. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.